Very excited about our next guest. Natasha Lennard is a great reporter. She's a columnist for The Intercept. Her work has appeared in The Nation, Bookforum, and The New York Times, among others. And she teaches critical journalism at the New School for Social Research in New York and is the author of Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life. Love that. What it means to be a non-fascist today.
Hi, how are you?
Very good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
So this trucker protest, we've probably done like 10 segments on this. And very early on, I mean, other than the fact that it seemed to just, it was like a media frenzy over what started off to, it was aggravating, but was not a large protest, but it's visibly large, like they're actual trucks. And then to see how the idea spread and really how it came about and the funding behind it. The right wing is just so good at political jiu-jitsu. And a lot of times the media and we on the left fall for it. I really like what you have to say here. So what can we learn from these protests?
Right. So, writers and broadcasters on the left, we do find ourselves in a difficult position sometimes of trying to figure out whether drawing any attention, even critical attention to these sort of constellations, these sort of aggravations, whether we're actually kind of helping give platform and spread. And yeah, partly for that reason, and partly just taking some time to think about it. I didn't actually write on the Convoy until this week. So it had already been situated and holding space really quite successfully it was heading into just past the third week. So, it sort of felt like, okay, I'm not kind of escalating the attention on something that, at the end of the day was holding up and disrupting a major capital in a powerful country, taking space, building a city within a city in front of the Canadian Parliament. I was also noticing that on a number of, far left signal threads and community groups, which I am part of, there was this almost prurient interest and questioning of like, ooh, is there a kind of anti-authoritarianism here that we shouldn't be neglecting? Which I found a certain discomfort with, because like, sure, you can squint, as I put in my article, and see beyond the kind of obviously individualist and violent resistance to any COVID protections being mandated, the possibility of a kind of working class, disaffected, anti-state, anti-authoritarian position. But as I say, if you squint too hard, your eyes are closed. And we can't be blind to there being really an essentially undergirding individualist, white settler colonialist ideology driving this, even if there are some kind of naive fellow travelers. This isn't some organic working class uprising that we could maybe find and bring to our side. There's too much undergirding, I would say. Yeah, whiteness, this idea of we should be able to travel freely and potentially spread disease across borders, especially considering these being, the occupied lands of Canada and the United States. There is a kind of echoing of that history of settler colonialism in this. Even if there are, a number of people of color who are taking part in this protest. But what I do point out or argue for is that while obviously we can have sympathy for Ottawans in the neighborhood who are like, God damn it, please, can I have some sleep? Fair enough. I think from the left, our problem with this convoy and the other kind of copycats it might inspire and probably will around the world, and already is not disruption. It's not the fact that it takes up this kind of circulation struggle. I think the way in which Indigenous groups from, Standing Rock being a kind of huge example in our country, the United States, of an incredible intervention in circulation struggle. And that's what, a lot of the Occupy encampments tried to do. So this idea of interjecting ourselves disruptively into the way capital flows and the way the movement of people is stopped, I think is strategically important. But that's just a tactical point. And certainly it's not like these truckers are the first people to do that. They've been able, up until this point where the police are moving in more aggressively, to hold space quite successfully. Some good strategy going on there, but also a lot of leniency from the police because of a lot of ideological agreement.
Well, they also have trucks. So it's not, they are also in massive trucks. So it's not like they're protesters chaining themselves in front of the Capitol or to Zuccotti Park. It's these are semi trucks and
right. And also I was thinking, which I didn't include in my article, I can recall I wrote a profile in a broader feature about the prosecutions after Standing Rock. And there was indigenous water protector who did end up going to jail, whose name was Rattler. And he was also a semi-truck driver. And he would be bringing supplies to the Standing Rock occupation and prayer camp consistently throughout the encampment. And so I was like, we have examples of really beautiful uses of semis for like our team. So I don't feel like we should cede that to the right at all. And nor should we be compelled by something that is kind of liberatory in name, but takes up a very troubling notion of individualistic freedom.
But this is, we're watching footage, by the way, of what had happened today, actually, in Ottawa. The police did move in. Still difficult, but yes, they moved in. And part of that is just, Trudeau has responded in a much more aggressive way than we probably are used to in this country when it comes to right-wing protests, especially if we're under presidents that are from the right, hence the Capitol riots. But, the other side of this is, well, you had a Standing Rock protester who's a trucker, and that's incredible and beautiful. It's rare, partly because, this is a predominantly male, white group of workers who are on the road an average of 300 days a year. This is insane to me. Listening to right-wing radio, because let's be real, there's no, I'm going to guess, like the one left-wing radio show, not listening to NPR. Just going to throw it out there. Probably not. Yes. And then they've got, they're disconnected from each other. So it's harder to have community. Maybe at truck stops, but you probably don't see the same people on a regular basis. So it's harder to communicate with each other about the actual issues, which are the working conditions. The working conditions are incredibly difficult, isolating. I'm sure there's depression and exhaustion. And, there was that case in Colorado, notably, about the trucker who veered off, was under trained and killed a family. And it was an incredibly tragic story. But this is an industry that is ripe for sort of a protest of some sort, but the conditions are also not set up to have like a unionized effort. Everyone's isolated from each other and listening to right-wing propaganda. And it's not like, there's kind of like a form of independence associated with it, rather than like, say, Starbucks workers, who many of them are very educated, younger, and mobilized in other areas. And, the conditions are happening everywhere. It's just the scenario is not really set up for like a left-wing trucker protest.
Well, yeah, it's hard. But also, to be clear, like when we say the truckers, we're using such a shorthand when we're talking about the convoy. Of course, most truckers, again, are, and even many people involved in that protest, it's been reported, are vaccinated. But even so, like, most truckers are not remotely involved in any sort of freedom convoy. So I don't think we have a kind of trucker problem. But I think the conditions you mention that can be conducive to that sort of right-wing manipulation are very much at play, and certainly not only with trucking, but by the same token, if you'd asked me 6-7 years ago, how do you think the unionization efforts are going to go in Starbucks, or how do you think the unionization efforts are going to go in at Amazon, I would have been like, ooh, that's a toughie.
Right.
These are precarious laborers on 0-hour contracts, but we have seen that shift. So, but notably those shifts happen, yes, there is a certain amount of salting sometimes, but also because a lot of kind of proletariat movements do know what is good and communal and collective, and creates better positions, and do know that who their real class enemy is. So I don't think we need to kind of be too petrified of a unbreakable false consciousness. But at the same time, it's not going to happen because we're like, oh, maybe we can sneak into this kind of set of protests we really disagree with and try and kind of lure people away. It's more about, okay, now how do we take it to the bosses? How do we take it to the major companies with workers, and sort of rather than try and do things on right-wing terms, because that's what liberals do.
That's exactly. Thank you. Put that on a put that on a sign and tattoo it on my arm. I don't know, whatever you want to say.
That's what liberals do.
That's what
also,
liberals do.
I mentioned in my column at the kind of conclusion-y bit that because I'd noticed that in some of these kind of chats I mentioned, where people were kind of curious and sometimes a little bit too curious about the constituents of these protests, they mentioned, well, think about the yellow vests in France, and how that was a huge broad working class movement, but definitely had not an insignificant far right element.
Yes.
And not insignificant from certain corners, fascist demands against immigration, not insignificant anti-Semitism, not insignificant anti-Semitic attacks. But yet, of course, you also had, under the umbrella of the Yellow Vest movement, of the uprising at the time, anti-fascists taking it to private property, taking it in the streets against fascist police, and also within the movement trying to expunge fascist elements as much as possible. The comparison is interesting. One distinction I would draw, though, is that a kind of generalized working class uprising will always be difficult and have conflicting internal politics that I don't think we should necessarily be okay with. Like, I don't think we should be like, oh, cool, the fascists can like stay as fascists. But at the same time, the way in which the Yellow Vests were taking on neoliberalism per se, or at least it kind of evolved into that, and it became a broader working class movement. I don't see the same being kind of possible in the very DNA of these freedom convoys, given how they're very much committed they are to a kind of individualist notion of freedom, and a white supremacist one at that, even if not everyone is white. That's not the condition of white supremacy. But also I wanted to draw specific attention to a kind of a movement within a movement, and also a movement in some conflict with a movement, which was the Black Vests, which was probably the largest existing collective of undocumented immigrants in France, who also used kind of the same intersection disruptive tactics, storming airports, occupying the Charles de Gaulle airport, which is like France's most kind of largest airport, to in resistance to Air France's complicity with deporting refugees and immigrants. So this kind of using the tactics, and even using the kind of vests working class umbrella, but on anti-fascist, anti-racist, anti-border, anti-state terms, I think is that kind of move we should be looking for and looking at. And if there's a response to these freedom convoys that speaks that kind of language of deploying tactics towards actually liberatory aims, that's where we should be putting our attention and support. And it's not like indigenous land and water protectors aren't already doing that and need support.
Right, exactly. And part of it is also just like how we are structured here. It's I can't even imagine Capitol riot protesters aligning with union workers in Bessemer anytime soon. But with that being said, sometimes it happens where the yoga movement, for instance, the spiritual wealth, and maybe folks who voted for Bernie Sanders are now fully on board with the anti-vax pipeline that leads to far right. It seems structured a little bit differently here. If that were to happen, I mean, what if someone listening says, I'm going to start a Facebook page or whatever you do nowadays, looking for my fellow leftist, like my fellow leftist members of this industry. I mean, whether it's actual long haul truckers or people in the trucking industry, I imagine, who are, who want to use their labor as a weapon against these really exploitative. I mean, it's extremely exploitative and extremely dangerous on top of it. How the companies are running these the trucking companies.
I mean, that would be great, but I'm not going to tell people what to do.
No, I think you should just let people listen.
And I'm sitting here in Brooklyn with a English accent, no, I'm not in community with that many long haul truckers, and that's probably a problem of how my life is organized potentially. But I wouldn't presume there aren't people within the trucking industry who are trying to make those moves and who already are. I couldn't speak to that. I think my column in that sense was more aimed towards a left being enamored by a spectacle of disruption without thinking of some of the underlying ideologies.
I want to shift gears real quick before you leave. You have this other piece out right now, and I guess briefly help us understand what's happening with Alabama right now. You have a piece in the Intercept titled "Supreme Court's Alabama Ruling is a Major Step Towards Dismantling the Voting Rights Act," which of course has already been under attack, and Democrats just don't, in power, just don't seem like they care that much. So what's happening here?
And this was from a couple of weeks ago when, so yes, for context, the Voting Rights Act has been being eaten away at for decades now. So it's, certainly not the robust, or at least somewhat robust legislation that it was built to be, by the early 80s when Section 2 was legislated and passed. So, we find ourselves at a moment with an extremely far-right court, with, feckless corporate Democrats who would rather not do away with the filibuster, not pass new voting rights legislation, and allow the continued disenfranchisement of Black people. So that's where we're at. And then there was as part of a kind of long history of right-wing racist gerrymandering, there was a redrawn district map in Alabama that was put into place by the Alabama legislature, right wing of course, that very much violated the Voting Rights Act and its demand that there not be voter dilution, and this would have meant that of the 7 voting districts in Alabama, only 1 would have Black majority representation. So you have 27% Black population in Alabama, but according to the redistricted map, there would only be kind of 14% in terms of how representation would work.
Wow.
So there was a lawsuit to stop this and demand that they redistrict, that this map not be deployed, and there be at least 2 majority Black districts, in accordance with the Voting Rights Act. And a federal court held that this new Republican map had to be redrawn, that it was in violation, and that it had to be redrawn. Within a shadow docket decision, so that's one of the ones where they're not hearing oral arguments, it's like a kind of swift, allegedly emergency order, putting things in place for later, future oral decisions in the Supreme Court, which is being used more and more in kind of a dodgy way. In one of those, the Supreme Court voted to freeze that panel of federal judges' orders, to say, look, you can't ask for them to redraw this Republican racist map, got to keep the racist map, which will then, at least be in place for the 2022 primaries and elections. So you've got a kind of racist map held in place by the Supreme Court, who will further consider arguments around this map in the next session. The problem is the rulings we can expect once oral arguments come to bear are not promising, given the makeup of this court. In fact, it's very troubling because in the decisions around this shadow docket order, you already had justices like Brett Kavanaugh say, what we really need to look at in the next session is the scope of this very crucial part of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, which allows plaintiffs, for example, minority plaintiffs, to say, we are having our votes diluted. We want to take this case to federal court and potentially to the highest court. And so if he says, Kavanaugh is saying, this is an incredibly confusing and there's been, histories of uncertainty with this Section 2. Not true. It's been standard case law for 40 years now, since 1982.
Wow.
And sure, there's been a couple of disagreements about it, but it's not something that the kind of judicial landscape has never been able to handle. This is clearly a very intentional, very clear, naked effort to just completely decimate the Voting Rights Act, to kind of establish the acceptedness of racial gerrymandering, that classic refrain of the racist, which is it's racist to talk about race, which you're seeing at play here every time these cases come up. So that's a threat, that there could be this removal or even further gutting of the Voting Rights Act, such that there is no standing for those who feel their votes are being disenfranchised or diluted. We now, even since I wrote that article, another troubling case has reached the federal court level and has been ruled on by a judge, which is an Arkansas case that quite specifically is trying to establish that the only body that could sue about Voting Rights Act's discriminatory violations would be an attorney general or a district attorney. So basically saying, private plaintiffs, citizens who feel that that their rights are being violated, that their votes are being threatened, couldn't do it, because at the time the Voting Rights Act was originally passed 56 years ago, Congress did not explicitly say, and private citizens can do this, and they can be the plaintiffs, and the state doesn't need to be the only plaintiff.
Private citizens have the right to sue whoever. I mean, this just seems.
Well, apparently this is because it's about kind of what the state is permitted to do as state, but it's nonsense. It's another kind of naked effort to disenfranchise people of color, because at the time, historically, you didn't need, it was considered a standard when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act that the plaintiffs could be any given citizen. Were centrist Democrats, right-wing Democrats, to actually enact voting rights legislation now, of course, that could be put clearly and could set new precedent for what voting rights legislation is, such that any of this alleged confusion, which is in fact not confusion, could be outright cleared up. But of course, they're not going to do that, and then they're going to lose the House and the Senate. So here we are. But no, it's troubling, and it's where things have been heading for a long time. But yes, now we have one case that is going to be considered, that's on the books to be considered in the next session, which is this Alabama map case. And now we also have a federal judge ruling that private citizens can't take these kind of Section 2 issues. They can't have standing in these cases. So, there's two options for the Supreme Court to rest upon to kind of have their racist, fascistic dreams come true.
No, literally. I mean, it's so egregious at this point. It's almost too much to process, I think, for most people. But also to sit there and just watch the Biden administration not even utter a peep about it.
Right. And this is the thing. There's just, of course, there needs to be a dramatic undoing of the standards that our judicial system has, including the Supreme Court and their power. And but, in terms of immediate possibilities, that feels like kind of very difficult and very far off. Not that we should not think about it. But obviously, we do have an elected Congress that is and a president who are, just being disgracefully pathetic and enabling at this point, and should never be allowed to forget it, and should see no peace.
Listen, I mean, they're the biggest donors of the Democratic Party. When the capital that runs the party says we are not giving you money until you deal with voting rights, as a party, the curtain's pulled back. What is going on with the Biden administration? If they're not answering to capital, then who do they answer to?
I mean, it's this is an ongoing question where we could talk forever about some sort of like internal intent, desire to lose, desire to just impossible incapacity to do politics, even in a self-serving way. And I can't begin to tell you what the drives of these people in power are. But we have more than enough evidence in effect to know that it's unacceptable, and we should make their lives incredibly uncomfortable. And a lot of people invest in doing that. But in the meantime, we also have to be, working with each other and supporting each other, because it's become quite clear that those in power won't.
100%. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us. This is really fascinating conversation about both the long haul truck movement that's happening, and of course, voting rights, which is always under attack. Thank you so much, Natasha. Natasha Lennard writes a column for The Intercept. Go check her out. Make sure to subscribe to her column or put alerts on. I don't know how you do it at The Intercept. I just get the email thing that you guys send, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Makes it so easy. Go sign up for the email thing. Yeah. Thank you so much, Natasha. We are independent media. Shocker. We don't depend on corporate interests. So we are relying on our loyal listeners, the ones who tune in regularly or try to tune in regularly and are committed to supporting progressive independent media. Because let me tell you something, if it doesn't financially work, we don't exist. We're able to do that because of our patrons. Go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. There's lots of swag available to certain patrons. You can get a mug, you can get a bag, you can get some stickers. We have exclusive content. We're going to be doing some meetings in a couple of weeks exclusively for our patrons. Go to patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. And if you are not already listening to us on the other platforms, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes. You can find us on the whole array. It's going to, there it is, right up on screen.